Today we're going to practice graphing functions and writing equations from graphs. So if possible, it would be very helpful if you could print the two worksheets and work out the problems with me. You'll also want to have one colored pencil or pen and or a highlighter. So our first worksheet, graphing functions. It says graph the following functions without using a calculator and state the pertinent information. So number one, y equals cosine theta minus 1. First thing we want to do is note our a, b, and c values. So a is 1, b is 1, it's the coefficient of theta, and c is negative 1. So this c of negative 1, that is our midline. So y equals negative 1 is our midline. So I'll just sketch a dotted or dashed line at y equals negative 1. Note that our a value is 1. Cosine starts off the midline, and in fact, in this case, 1 above the midline. So from my midline, I go up 1. Now, our midline is y equals negative 1. Next, we want to know our period. What is the length for one cycle, one cosine cycle for this equation? So period is 2 pi over b, and our b value is 1. So 2 pi over 1 is simply 2 pi. So the length of one full cycle for this equation of cosine is a distance of 2 pi. So meaning since cosine here is starting 1 above the midline, then at 2 pi it's going to end at that same height. Midway between, at pi radians, it will be at its minimum point, 1 below the midline. And then at pi over 2 radians, it'll be on the midline at 3 pi over 2 radians on the midline. So we have our 5 points, and now we connect them. Again, you're trying to connect it with a nice smooth curve. These are not line segments. Your amplitude is the absolute value of A. The absolute value of 1 is 1. Your frequency is the reciprocal of the period. Let's just say capital P. And our period was 2 pi. So the frequency is 1 over 2 pi. Number 2, y equals 3 sine theta. And write down A, B, and C. So here C, there's nothing, so C is equal to 0. So our midline is y equals 0, which is the same as this is your x-axis. Sine starts on the midline. A is 3. So we're starting on the midline. And then it's going to go up to its max, which is going to be 3 above the midline. Let's find its period. Period equals 2 pi over b, and b is 1. So the period is 2 pi. So it requires a distance of 2 pi radians for one complete sine cycle. Let me go down here and fill in some of this before I plot our points. So our midline is y equals 0. Our amplitude, the absolute value of 3 is 3. Our period's 2 pi. And the frequency is the reciprocal, 1 over 2 pi. Okay, so we start on the midline at distance of 2 pi. We'll be back on the midline. Midway between, on the midline. Start and middle, and now between 0 and pi, it will be 3 units above the midline at its maximum, and then between pi and 2 pi radians, it'll be 3 units below the midline at its minimum. Number 3, y equals 1/2 cosine theta plus 1. Again, pull out your A, B, and C values. So C is 1, so our midline is y equals 1. This is cosine, and it starts off the midline. Sorry, let me draw the midline first. Okay, so going back to this is cosine starts off the midline. In this case, A is positive 1/2, so it will start half a unit above the midline. If it was negative 1/2, it would start half a unit below the midline. So our midline is y equals 1. We need our period. Period is 2 pi over b, and b here is 1. So 2 pi over 1 is simply 2 pi. So it requires a distance of 2 pi for one cycle of cosine. So it's going to start half a unit above. It's going to end at 2 pi radians, half a unit above its midline. And midway between at pi radians, it's going to be half a unit below its midline. Start, end, middle, and now between the start of 0 radians and pi radians, it will be on the midline. And between pi and 2 pi at 3 pi over 2 radians on the midline. The amplitude is the absolute value of A, which is 1/2. Our period was 2 pi, and our frequency is the reciprocal. Number 4, y equals sine 1/2 theta. A is 1, B is 1/2, and C is 0. So our midline is y equals 0, which is the same as the x-axis. This is our midline. This is sine, so it starts on the midline. And our period is 2 pi over b, which in this case, b is 1/2, so 2 pi divided by 1/2. Division by 1/2 is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal, so 4 pi. So it requires a length of 4 pi to get one complete sine cycle in. So I'm going to change, and please you do the same, because this is only going to 2 pi. That means I will only, if I was to draw this only on this grid alone, I'll only get half of my sine curve. So I'm going to change this. I'm going to make this 4 pi and this 2 pi, and then half of 2 pi would be pi. And so 1 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi. I want to see the one complete cycle. Okay, so it requires a distance of 4 pi. So it's starting on the midline at 4 pi radians. It'll be back where it started from on the midline. midway between on the midline. And then our a value was 1. So between 0 and 2 pi, at pi radians, it will be 1 above its midline at its max. And at 3 pi radians, it would be 1 below its midline. So here we have one full cycle of sine. Midline was y equals 0. Our amplitude is 1. Our period was 4 pi. So the frequency is the reciprocal, 1 over 4 pi. Number 5, y equals cosine 2 theta. So A, B, and C. Again, our midline is the x-axis, is y equals 0. A is 1, so the amplitude is the absolute value of 1, which is 1. And our period (2 pi divided by 2) is pi. So our period is pi. So the length of one complete cosine cycle here will require a distance of pi radians. So from 0 to pi, I'll have one complete cosine cycle. Cosine starts off the midline, so in this case it's going to start 1 above the midline, and our midline is the x-axis. At pi, it's going to end at that same maximum height, and halfway between 0 and pi, at pi over 2, it'll be 1 below its midline. So it'll be at its minimum height. And between 0 and pi over 2, it will be on the midline, so halfway between, and halfway between here on the midline. So there we have one cycle of our cosine of y equals cosine 2 theta. And then from pi to 2 pi, that's another distance of pi radians. We'll have a second cycle. So max to max, min, on the midline, on the midline. And the frequency would be the reciprocal, 1 over pi. Okay, next up is let me pause this. Okay, so now the other worksheet here, writing equations from graphs. So given the graph, we want to come up with each equation. First thing we want to do is determine the midline. So I think I'm going to use a highlighter for this, but if we take to determine the midline, the max is here at 2, the min is here at -2, so the midline has to be midway between, remember, or the average. 2 plus -2 is 0, divided by 2 is 0. So the midline here is our x-axis. This is our midline. So that means that our c value is equal to 0. And since this graph starts on the midline, right, it starts on the midline, so this is a sine function. And what is the length of one complete sine cycle? Well, it starts on the midline, up to max, down to min, back up to the midline. So right there. Maybe I'll just use this. So the period is 2 pi. That means we can get b from this. B is equal to 2 pi over the period. So 2 pi divided by 2 pi is 1. So we have our C and B value. Now our A value, we can use the formula max minus min divided by 2. But since we have it graphed, it's just very easy to see that, oh, well, how far above from the midline do we go up to get to our max? It's a distance of 2 from here to there. So A is 2. So our equation is y equals 2 sine x plus 0. That's it. Y equals 2 sine 1x. We don't put the 1 because 1 times x is x. And the plus 0 is just going to be 2 sine x. Number 2, determine the midline. We've got a max here and a min here. It's got to be midway between. Here's our midline. Or if you want, no, you can draw it dashed. So our midline is 2. That means our C value is 2. This function starts off the midline, right? Starts 1 unit above. Well, 1 unit above, that's our A value. And it is cosine function. So now we need the period. Or sorry, the B value. Using the period. Cosine starts at max, comes down to min, back at max, right here. What's the distance, the length, from start to end for one full cycle? It's 2 pi. So our period is 2 pi, and our B value equals 2 pi divided by the period. So B equals 2 pi divided by 2 pi, which is 1. A is 1, B is 1, and C is 2. And this is cosine. Y equals 1 times cosine is just going to be cosine. So y equals cosine x plus 2. Number 3. Determine the midline, max, min. Midway between 1 and -1 is the x-axis, is y equals 0 is our midline. So C equals 0. This starts on the midline. Right, this graph starts on the midline. So that means it's a sine. It's a graph of a sine function. So from the midline, go up to max, down to min, back on the midline. So this is one complete cycle for sine. Okay, what is its length? Well, it looks to me like it might be this is 1/2. From here to here is a 1/2 pi. So it looks like this is 2/3 pi, right? Because here would be 3/4. So this is 2/3 pi. 2/3 pi. Yeah, it's definitely 2/3. Right, so then our period is equal to 2/3 pi. We need to find b. So b equals 2 pi over the period. So 2 pi divided by 2/3 pi is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal, 2 pi times 3/2 pi. I'm sorry. Yeah, I should write it as 2 pi over 3, so 3 over 2 pi. That'd be easier. All right, so the 2 pi's divide out here and here. So b equals 3. And what is a? That's the only thing we're missing. From the midline, we go 1 above to reach the max. So a is 1. So y equals 1 times sine, b is 3x, plus 0. So y equals sine 3x. Yeah, I'm just going to go back, and this 2/3 pi is the same as 2 pi over 3. This way, when we take we multiply by the reciprocal of 2 pi over 3, we're multiplying by 3 over 2 pi. So certainly, if you're more than welcome to, stop the video, try the next one on your own if you want. Okay, number 4, determine the midline. Oh, we've got a min, a max. Midway between is the x-axis, so y equals 0 is our midline, so that means our c value is 0. This starts off the midline, and in fact it starts 1 below the midline. So this is a cosine function, and the a value is 1 below, so a is -1. What is the length of one complete cosine cycle here? Min to max, back to min. So it stops right here. So the period is 2 pi. That means that b equals 2 pi over the period p. 2 pi over 2 pi is 1. B equals 1. Our equation, y equals -1 cosine x. So y equals negative cosine x. Number 5, determine the midline. Well, here's a minimum and here's a maximum. Midline is midway between. Here's our midline. So our midline is y equals 1. So our c value is 1. This starts on the midline. So this is a sine function. What is the length for one complete sine cycle here? Midline, min, max, back on midline. So here's one complete sine cycle, which has a length of 2 pi. So our period is 2 pi. So b equals 2 pi over the period of 2 pi, which is 1. It starts on the midline and goes down 1 below the midline. So that means a is -1. We're going 1 below. We didn't start from the midline and go up to its max. Nope, we went down to a minimum first, and it's 1 below the midline. So this is y equals -1 sine x plus 1. Make sure you're closing the parentheses after the x and then adding your c value, right? Don't have it as x plus 1 in parentheses. That's incorrect. And number 6. Determine the midline. Well, here's a max, here's a min, here's our midline. If they were much further apart, then remember you can always find your C value, your midline value, by taking the max plus the min, dividing by 2. This function starts off the midline, and it's actually starting 1 unit above the midline. So since it's starting off the midline, this is definitely a cosine function. It's starting 1 unit above, so that means that our A value is 1, positive 1. And what is the length? Oh, sorry. C here is negative 1. Right, our midline is y equals negative 1. So where was I? Oh, what is the length of one complete cosine function here? Or cosine cycle. So we start at our max, come down to our min, back to our max. That's one cycle. What's the length? It's pi. So the period is pi. B equals 2 pi over the period. 2 pi divided by pi is 2. So B is 2. A is positive 1, B is positive 2, C is negative 1. Y equals cosine, parentheses 2x minus 1. Okay, once again, thank you for your attention, and I hope you are all well and stay well.